Hello friends, welcome to Ashok IT. In this video, we will be seeing constructors in Java. That is, what is constructor, what are the types of constructor, and why we use constructor, and the example for constructor. And also, we will be saying what is meant by constructor overloading and constructor chaining. So, what is constructor? Constructor in Java is a special method that is used to initialize objects. So for initializing the class object, we use constructor, and why we use is to set the initial values for object attributes. And the types of constructor in Java are default constructor and parameterized constructor. And here is a simple example of constructor where there is a class student, and inside the student class we are creating a constructor which is having same name as student class, and here the constructor having no arguments, so it is a default constructor. And constructor overloading, when we say constructor overloading, when we have more than one constructor with different parameters in the class, then it is called constructor overloading. And when we call constructor from another constructor, it is called constructor chaining. So let's see what is constructor. Constructor in Java, it is a special method which is used for initializing the class objects, and the constructor is called whenever object of class is created. And we use constructor for setting the initial values for object attributes. And in Java, constructor is block of code which is similar to a method, and it is called or invoked when instance of class is created. That is, when we create object for the class, the constructor is called or invoked. And at the time of calling or invoking the constructor, memory for the object is allocated. And it is a special type of method used for initializing object, and every time a object is created using new keyword, at least one constructor is called. So we use constructors to assign values to class variables at the time of object creation, and it can be done either explicitly by the programmer or it's done by Java itself using the default constructor. So each time an object is created using new keyword, at least one constructor, which may be default constructor also, is invoked to assign initial values to data members of same class. And the rules for writing constructor are: the constructor must have same name as the class name in which it resides or for which it is created. And a constructor in Java cannot be declared as abstract, final, static, or synchronized. So a constructor cannot be abstract, cannot be final, cannot be static, or cannot be synchronized. And access modifiers can be used in constructor declaration to control its access. And constructor does not return value, so no return type is used in the constructor declaration. Now let's see what are the types of constructor in Java. So there are two types of constructors in Java, that is default constructor with no arguments, and the other one is parameterized constructor, the constructor with parameters or arguments. So when constructor is written without any argument, it is default constructor, and when constructor is written with arguments or parameter, it is called parameterized constructor. So default constructor has no parameters and is known as the no argument constructor also. So a constructor that has no parameters is known as default constructor, and it is invisible. By default, it is present internally, but if we write a constructor with no arguments in the program, then the compiler does not create a default constructor. It is replaced by the one which we create. So let's see here a simple example for default constructor. So for writing a default constructor, we use the class name which followed by no arguments, that is parenthesis with no arguments, and then we give a default constructor definition. So here we have taken a class pen inside which we created a default constructor having same name as the class, that is pen, and The definition contains a statement that prints default constructor. And in the main method, when we instantiate the class, that is, when we create object for the pen class, the default constructor gets invoked and it will be printing on screen default constructor. So we get as output default constructor when we create object for class pen. So let's see it practically. So here is a file student.java that contains a class student, and here we have created a default constructor. So here we have taken for the constructor the same name as the class name, that is student, and we have taken in parentheses no arguments. So there are 0 arguments, which makes it a default constructor. And the definition contains a statement that prints welcome to student class on output screen when this constructor is called or invoked. So for invoking this constructor, we need to create object of this class, or we need to instantiate this class in the main method. So main method we have another class basic. So here in the main method, I am creating object for student class as S1. So here using the student class, S1 is the object which is created for it. And we are using here the new operator to assign memory to it. And this is the constructor call. So when we instantiate the student class, that is when we create object for the student class, the constructor gets invoked. So when we run this program, we will be getting as output welcome to student class, which is coming from the constructor student, which is the default constructor. So that was the default constructor which was taken in the student class. So here the class name is pen, but in our example we have taken student, and here the constructor name is pen and our constructor name was student. Now next, let's see what is parameterized constructor. So parameterized constructor in Java has parameters. So constructor that has parameters is known as parameterized constructor. And if we do not want, if we want to initialize fields of a class, that is, if we want to assign values to the class data members with our own values, then we can use parameterized constructor. So constructor that has parameters is parameterized constructor and is used to initialize class fields, that is the data members or instance variables of class. So let's see here a simple example of parameterized constructor. So this constructor will contain parameters. In the parenthesis here, we are writing parameters. So constructor will have same name as class name followed by the parameters, and within the curly brackets, we write the definition for it. So here in the example, we have taken a student class, and the student class has a data member here as string name, and there is a constructor with parameter as string name, and the constructor has same name as class name, and within the constructor we are assigning to the instance variable name the value taken from the parameter of constructor. So this dot name here refers to the class member, that is student class data member name. Equal to name here is the parameter present in parameterized constructor. So when we create object or when we instantiate student class, at the time of instantiating, we provide the value for the parameter, which will be initializing the instance variable name. So let's see in example practically. Let's see the example practically in Eclipse IDE. So we have seen already a default constructor. Now let's take a parameterized constructor. So it will have same name as class name, but we can write here the parameters. So I am taking here a string name as the parameter, and in the class student, I will be taking here string student name as the data member. So here we have student name as an instance variable or data member of class student. And here is the parameterized constructor that contains a parameter name. And inside this constructor can write this dot studname, which refers to the instance variable student name equal to name. So we are using the parameter or argument of constructor to assign value to the instance variable of the class. So with this line, we are assigning to studname the name taken by the parameter. So we can invoke this constructor by creating object for the class student. So here I'm creating the object as S2 using the new operator and again the constructor call. Now, while creating the object, I will be passing here to the parameter a value. So here I am providing the string as Ram. So because the parameter here is of type string and it is a name, I am providing a string that is a name in the double quotations. So when we create object S2 by providing value, it will be invoking the parameterized constructor, which will assign value to the instance variable stu name. Now if we print using system.out.println, I'm printing here the name which I will be accessing using the object s2 dot student name. So the name which we are assigning to the instance variable, we are printing it using this println statement. So upon execution, I get name is Ram. So this is done by the parameterized constructor, so which we are using here for initializing the class field studname, or we are assigning value to the instance variable studname using this parameterized constructor. So that was parameterized constructor, which was used to initialize the class field. And next we will be seeing the copy constructor. So copy constructor is not present in Java internally. So there is no inbuilt copy constructor available in Java, but we can create our own copy constructor by passing the object of class to the other object of class. So copy constructor in Java, it is mainly used for copying one object values to the created object. So we can copy one object value to another object using the copy constructor. And it is not present. It is not present in Java, but we can use it or create it by passing object of a class to another object. Copy constructor is passed with another object which copies data available from the passed object to the newly created object. So for copying the values of object to the created object, we use copy constructor. Here is a simple example. So for the copy constructor, in arguments, we will be passing the object of the class. And here is a simple example where we have a parameterized constructor with string name as parameter. And then the other constructor here is a copy constructor which contains the student class object S as the argument. So to the copy constructor, while creating object, we will be passing another object which will be substituted in its argument, and the other object which we are passing, its values will be copied to the current object which we are creating to invoke the copy constructor. And this object now will contain the other object's values which we can print and see practically. So to see it practically, let's open in Eclipse. So here in Eclipse, we have our example where we have used the default constructor and a parameterized constructor. Now let's create a copy constructor where we will be having arguments as the class object. So I'm taking student S, that is the class object. as argument for this constructor. Now this dot studname equal to, I will be taking s dot studname. So when I write this dot studname, it refers to the class member studname, whereas when I write s dot studname, it refers to the student name value, which is for this object s. So we can substitute any object in place of s. So for that object, whatever is the student name, that will be substituted in this place. So here this dot studname equal to s dot studname. Now let's create an object in main method. So here in main method, I'm creating object s3 equal to new operator and student. And here, instead of passing directly the value, here I will be passing other object s2. So for s2, that is the second object, we have here the name as Ram. For studname, we have assigned the value Ram. So here we have not taken any name or string, but we have taken a class object s2 here. So when we write s2 here, this statement will invoke the copy constructor, and in place of s2 will be substituted, and this dot studname equal to s2 dot studname, that is nothing but Ram. So studname will again be getting the value as Ram, which is nothing but the value of student name for s2 object. So now if I print again the student name using s3 object, so here let's write here object s2, and here object s3. So when I run this, the student name for s3 object, we will be getting as Ram. So we can copy the value of another object to the current object, that is to the object being created, or we can use it by modifying it also. Like I can add here another string to it, like so s dot studname plus Rao. So I have modified the other object's values by adding another string to it as Rao. So here I have passed s2. s2 dot name is copied. Also we have modified by adding it plus Rao. So we will be getting the name for s3 object as Ram Rao. So this way we can copy values from other object to the newly created object using the copy constructor. So that was the copy constructor, which copies one object values to other object or object being created. So default constructor has no arguments. Parameterized constructor has arguments and is mainly used for initializing the class fields, that is the instance variables of class. And copy constructor will have arguments as the object of class, and we use copy constructor for copying the object values to the object being created. Now let's see what is constructor overloading. So overloading or constructor overloading in Java, it is a technique of having more than one constructor with different parameter list. So in the class, if we have multiple constructors with different parameters, then it is called constructor overloading. So they are arranged in a way that each constructor performs different tasks, and they are differentiated by compiler by number of parameters in the list and their types. So the compiler will invoke the constructor, parameterized constructor, by matching the number of parameters they contain. So here is a simple example. So in the class student here, We have a parameterized constructor where there is only a single parameter int I, and which is assigning value to the ID variable of class. And then we have another constructor which has two parameters int I and string n, which is assigning values to both the data members or variables of class. And then we have a member function or method display which prints ID and name. So here, when we create object by passing a single value, then it calls or invokes the first parameterized constructor, which has a single parameter int I. And when we create object with two values, that is one integer and one string, then it will call the second parameterized constructor and assign value to ID and name. And when we call the method display using S1, it will be just printing ID. And when we call the method with S2 object, then it will be printing ID and name, that is 222 and Aryan. So let's see it practically. So here in this program, we have seen the three types of constructor: default, parameterized, and copy. So now I will be taking a parameterized constructor where I will be taking int I. And this parameterized constructor also I will modify by writing int I in the parameters. So here we have a constructor that has single parameter, and we have another constructor that has two parameters. And let's take here int student ID as the data member of class. So now we have two data members of class, and here there are two parameterized constructors, one with single parameter which is initializing the student ID, and here we will be using this second parameterized constructor for initializing ID and also the name. So here parameterized constructor with two arguments, parameterized constructor with one argument. Now in the main method, so I will be here removing all the other code. So here I am creating object as S1, and I am here passing a single value that is for ID as 1, 2, 3. And I will be creating another object as S2 equal to new, and here I am passing the ID as 999 and name as Ram. So I'm providing two values, one for ID and one for name. So let's take in the same class a function, a method to display ID and name of the class. So I'm taking here void display as a member function or method which will be displaying ID and name. So I will be here giving ID as student ID, and we will be printing the name as student name. Proper spacing. So this function, when we call it, it will print the student ID and name. So using the S1 object, here I will be calling the display function which will display ID and name. Again here S2, I will be calling the display method which will be displaying ID and name. So while creating S1 object, we have passed a single value which is an integer value. So this will invoke the constructor which has single integer parameter. So this will be initializing the student ID using 1, 2, 3 as the I value. So for I, we are passing the value as 1, 2, 3, which will be substituted here and assigned to student ID. And then in the second case, that is when we are creating S2 as object, we are passing two values. One is integer, one is string. So 999 as ID, Ram as name will be substituted in place of I and name, which will be assigned to student ID and student name for the third object S2. So S1 dot display, when we call the display method using S1 object, we get the ID displayed, And when we call the method using s2, we get ID and name displayed. So when we run the program, we get null for the name because we are not passing name, we are passing only ID. So it initializes only ID. This is the first constructor, first parameterized constructor, which is initializing ID. And we get ID and name displayed as 999 and RAM by the second parameterized constructor. So first initializing only ID, second initializing ID and name. So this is called constructor overloading when we have multiple constructors with different parameters. So here there is default constructor with no parameter, parameterized constructor with a single parameter, and again a second parameterized constructor with two parameters. So that was constructor overloading, where we have constructors with different arguments or different number of parameters. So parameters of the constructor will differ and constructor will exist multiple times. That is constructor overloading. Now let's see what is constructor chaining. In a constructor chain, a constructor is called from another constructor in same class. So the process is known as constructor chaining. When a constructor is called by other constructor, it is called constructor chain or constructor chaining as the process. And it occurs through inheritance also. So we can call the constructor from the child class also. And when we create an instance of derived class, all the constructors of inherited class, that is base class, are first invoked. After that, the constructor of calling class, that is a child class or a derived class, are invoked. And we can call the constructor using this keyword or super keyword. So in the same class, if we are calling the constructor, we can use this keyword. And if in a child class we are calling constructor, then we can use super keyword. Here is a simple example for constructor calling, where there is a default constructor and a parameterized constructor in student class. So default constructor has no arguments. Parameterized constructor has argument str of type string, and this parameterized constructor prints parameterized constructor called followed by the str, that is string variable. So here in the default constructor, we are invoking the parameterized constructor using this keyword and passing the value for the parameter str as RAM. So when we write this and RAM, then the parameterized constructor gets invoked and we get a message parameterized constructor called, and str will get a value RAM. So this will be the output: parameterized constructor called RAM, then the default constructor message as default constructor called. So let's see it practically to understand it more clearly. So we have seen already the default constructor, the constructor overloading with parameterized constructors of two different types of arguments, and then a method we have used, and also a copy constructor. So I am here now removing all other constructors, just keeping a default constructor and a parameterized constructor. So let's not, so I am here using only student name and this parameterized constructor here. I am giving a parameter as to string name. Here in this parameterized constructor, the parameter I have modified here as string name, and I will be assigning it to the class member this dot to name equal to name. And in this parameterized constructor itself, I will be printing the name. So here this dot to name I'm taking, which will be printed. It is not only assigning but also printing on screen the name, the parameterized constructor. And default constructor will be giving a message, welcome to student class. So here in the default constructor, if I write this and a value for name, as Ram, suppose. So in the default constructor, I am giving the value for the parameter as Ram and calling the default constructor. Whenever we are calling the constructor, it must be a first statement before any other statement in the constructor. So first the constructor will be called, then any other statement will be executed. So that's the reason here we got an error. Constructor call must be the first statement in constructor. So whenever we are calling a constructor from another constructor, always the constructor call must be written first, then any other statement in the constructor. So here this will make a call to parameterized constructor, and the statements present in parameterized constructor will get executed, and then it comes back to default constructor and execute the statements that belong to default constructor. So in the main method, if we are creating object for the student class as S, so here I'm creating object for the student class, but I'm not providing any value to the argument. So this will make a call to default constructor, no argument constructor. So when we run the program, we get name as Ram, welcome to student class. This is coming from the default constructor. So we are getting this because the default constructor calls the parameterized constructor. So from parameterized constructor, we get the name as Ram, and welcome to student class we are getting from the default constructor definition. So here we are calling the constructor, calling parameterized constructor, and this process is also called constructor chaining. Constructor chaining is the process. So calling a constructor from another constructor is called constructor chaining, and that was all about constructors in Java. So thank you for watching the video, and please like, share and subscribe the channel for more updates on Java.